So, what if I told you that the entire global economy, with all its crazy booms and busts, actually operates like a simple machine? Well, in the next few minutes, we're going to break down Ray Dalio's incredible template that shows you exactly how that machine works.
Okay, so this is Dalio's core idea. The economy feels insanely complicated, right? But he says it's really just a machine, and it's driven by a few really simple parts and predictable forces. You know what powers it all? Human nature.
And to understand this machine, we only need to get our heads around three key forces. First, there's the slow, steady climb of productivity growth. Then you have the familiar ups and downs of the short-term debt cycle. And finally, there's this massive, once-in-a-lifetime wave called the long-term debt cycle.
But before we get to those huge forces, we have to start small. We've got to look at the machine's smallest, most fundamental gear, the one that makes everything else turn. We're starting with the transaction.
It really is that simple. You know, every time you buy a coffee, pay for Netflix, or even buy a stock, you're creating a transaction. And the entire economy, it's literally just the sum of all those transactions happening at any given moment.
Now, you might think money is what makes the economic world go round. And yeah, that's part of the story. But the real driver, the powerful, volatile engine behind all the cycles we go through, is credit.
Think about it this way. When you pay with cash, the deal is done, it's over. But when you use credit, it's like starting a bar tab. You're making a promise to pay later. And right in that moment, you literally create an asset for the lender and a liability for yourself. Just poof, out of thin air.
And get this is where the scale just becomes mind-boggling. In the U.S. economy, you've got roughly $50 trillion in credit floating around. Compare that to only about $3 trillion in actual money. That huge difference is exactly why credit, not cash, is the real force shaping everything.
And this, right here, this is the engine of the whole cycle. See, because credit lets us spend more than we actually earn, it kicks off this powerful self-reinforcing pattern. More spending means higher incomes for other people, which makes them more creditworthy, which leads to even more borrowing and spending. You see how it feeds on itself? But that explosion of spending can't just go on forever. It doesn't create some smooth, straight line of growth. Nope. Instead, it creates predictable cycles. So let's look at the first gear in this machine, the short-term debt cycle.
So this is the rhythm we all kind of feel, right? It usually lasts about 5 to 8 years. It's this mechanical loop. Easy credit fuels an expansion, which eventually leads to inflation. Then the central bank steps in, hikes interest rates to cool things down, and that often leads to a recession. Then, of course, they lower rates again, and the whole dance starts over.
Okay, so now let's zoom out. If we pull back from those 5 to 8 year waves, we can see how they build on top of each other to create something way bigger and way more powerful. This is the big picture, the long-term debt cycle.
Over the really long run, the single most important thing that raises our living standards is productivity growth. Just think of this as the baseline, a steady, upward march powered by all our innovation and hard work.
But our day-to-day experience of the economy isn't that nice, smooth line, is it? It's dictated by the swings of that short-term debt cycle, which wiggles up and down all around that productivity line.
And this right here, this slide just illustrates the final piece of the puzzle perfectly. See how each peak and each trough in the cycle is just a little bit higher than the last one? Well, that's human nature at work. We just tend to borrow and spend a little more in each upswing. And over 75 to 100 years, that behavior makes debt rise faster than income, creating this one massive long-term wave.
But at the very peak of this huge wave, think 1929 or think 2008, the system just can't support the weight of all that debt anymore. The repayments become way bigger than what incomes can handle, and the whole thing violently reverses. This dramatic reversal triggers what is a painful but totally necessary system reset. It's called a deleveraging, and it's the moment the entire economic machine is forced to unwind all of its successes. And here's the massive problem during a deleveraging. The central bank's main tool, lowering interest rates to get people to borrow again, it just doesn't work. The rates are already at or near zero. The medicine is gone. So policymakers have to get creative. Dalio points to 4 main levers they can pull to get debt back in line with income. We're talking about cutting spending, restructuring debts, redistributing wealth through taxes, and as a last resort, printing money. The real challenge here is finding the right balance. On one side of the scale, you have the really painful deflationary stuff, like cutting spending and defaulting on debt.
On the other side, you've got the inflationary, stimulative things, like taxing the rich to redistribute wealth and having the central bank print new money. A successful deleveraging needs a very delicate mix of all four.
And it's a big if policymakers get that delicate mix just right, the result is what Dalio calls a beautiful deleveraging. It's that sweet spot where debts fall relative to income, but the economy avoids a total collapse and can actually start a slow, stable recovery.
So after putting this entire economic machine together, from the tiniest transaction to the great deleveraging, what are the key takeaways? What's the operator's manual for all of us?
Well, Dalio boils this whole complex machine down to 3 simple but incredibly powerful rules. And check it out. These rules don't just apply to governments or central banks. They apply to us, to individuals, to businesses. In the long run, productivity is everything.
Ultimately, this framework isn't about perfectly predicting the future. It's about having a map to understand the present and see the forces at play, which, of course, leaves us with one final, pretty provocative question to think about. Looking at this machine, where do you think we are in the cycle right now?